Welcome to another episode of Transformation in Trials. Today in the studio with me, I have Wessam Sonbol, who is the founder and CEO of Delph Health.
Hello, Rana. Good to meet you here.
Nice to have you. Today we're going to talk about patient wearables for digital health and clinical trials. And just to get us started, can you tell us more about, typically in a clinical trial, how would we collect data in the good old days?
You know what? The good old days is I'm a patient. I go to the doctor's office. The doctor asks me a few questions. I give them my question, whether they're accurate or not, and that's about it. It's actually an interesting story. Um, we ran into this in the past with an Alzheimer's study where a patient was in pain. Patient got to the doctor's office. And the patient actually had like their caregiver with them, right? And when the doctor asked them, how was your pain on a scale of, 0 to 10, the patient was like, I'm at about a 7. And the caregiver was like, I think it would have probably more than that because based on, what we felt in the past, right? Um, so anyway, so
Mm.
that's kind of how we've collected it in the past. We can only get the data when the patient comes into the office or somehow by third-hand recording of the data. So
Mm. And then wearables come in, but also just the patient-reported outcomes, which were kind of the step before wearables.
Mhm.
And how has that evolved this space?
Yeah, I think between wearables and patient-reported outcomes, but we should probably talk about patient-reported outcomes first.
Mm.
Uh, this industry is really slow to adopt in general, right? I mean, even till today, 15% of studies are still conducted on paper, right? Not
Mm.
even in EDC system, paper. So as we fast forward to today with PROs, I think we still have ways for PROs. We've gotten so much better today than we were 10 years ago, um, especially now that we have mobile phones. So in the past, even from a PRO data, it used to be a sheet of paper, right? You
Mm.
give some a paper and diary, collect them. They come into the parking lot, they fill them out before they come into the doctor's office, right? And it's getting better today where we have like mobile apps, we have text messages, we have artificial intelligence that can automate phone calls, right? So I think we're getting better, but as technology evolves, I think we're gonna get even better. Um, as we get into PROs and wearables, we look at wearables as part of the PROs, right? However, um, I think from a last presentation I did, there was only about maybe 15,000 studies that have really used wearables. So I think we're still
Mm.
ways away from using a ton of wearables in our studies. Um, but as we look at wearables, the patient goes in the doctor's office, they go home, and we've got no clue what happens to that patient, right? So
Mm.
there are pros and cons when it comes to wearables. The pros is we learn a lot more from patients than we ever have, right? We learn more about, their habits, their movements, their heart rate, their sleep, their stress. There's so much information that we can get from these patients. But then there's also the problem of we've got so much data, we don't
Mhm.
really know what to do with it. Um, but then also we've got the problems of people come in and making some unrealistic expectations of like, I want to get, heartbeats per second, and we're like,
Mm.
well, if I give you heartbeats per like 2 minutes, there's still a ton of data that you don't know what to do with it. Um, so I think people are still not sure what do we do,
Mm.
um, and how do we look at wearables? But then there are also oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, you're gonna say something.
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, so yes, there are a lot of wearables, they collect different things, we don't know what to do with it. One of the questions that I get most often is, uh, do the wearables measure anything that can be used for clinical purposes? Is any of it actually valid?
So I think it can be valid based on what are we looking after, right? So there's only maybe like a handful of studies where these wearables were the primary endpoint, right? in most other scenarios, the wearables are either, observational, or secondary is we're trying to figure out what's really happening. Um, One of the biggest problems we see often is somebody will come in and say, hey, we're giving these patients treatments. We want to give them a watch to, see their activity after their treatment, right? And we're like, well, you've got a bigger problem. You don't even know what your baseline is. You don't even know what that patient was moving before the treatment or not to figure out whether this wearable is really going to help you in the study or not. But we've also seen kind of the positive effect where some studies we've seen where we've given patients like an Apple Watch or whatever, and they're seeing like, hey, these patients were not mobile at all before the study. And now guess what? They're actually more mobile. And we've seen other stuff we're saying like, hey, these patients have in the past recorded that they're going to the doctor X number of times, and now their doctor visits have reduced dramatically, you know? So there are benefits to the wearables, whether in a clinical trial or outside of the clinical setting. I think it'd be amazing to learn more as we put wearables on these patients for a longer period of time.
Mm.
So that way, do we know like what is their quality of life beyond, weeks and months? What does it really look like from a patient perspective? And as you look at like value-based care is going to be
Mm.
huge, right? When it comes to these wearables, can you, imagine you can utilize a wearable device so that we can measure heart rate, breathing, whatever, like a ton of wearables that we can talk about. And, we consider uh, well, as you're going to commercialization, what is it really going to look like? And is it going to make you, give you better evidence for, value-based care? I'm a believer. I mean, even when you look at some cancer studies, I believe there's a need now to collect more of, heart rate based on, some drugs, et
Mm.
cetera. So how are we going to do that? Are we going to ask the patient to go to the doctor every now and then, or can we use some sort of an FDA cleared device with some of these patients at home that can have at least like a good 90% accuracy,
Mm.
uh, and we can transmit this data in like near real time, you
Mm.
know?
I kind of want to go back to the patient-reported outcomes because the purpose of those was to understand more the patient, not just as a kind of an object where there's some stimuli and response
Mhm.
and stuff we can measure, but also what is their experience with the disease. And it sounds like that from wearables, we can learn way more about the experience of being a patient than we could just by like measuring stuff on the patient. And that seems to me that it creates a new kind of data that we may not even know what to do with exactly, like you were saying about movement earlier. Suddenly we see more movement,
Mhm.
but did we measure things like that before, or is this a new type of information that we're getting for treatment?
Yeah, I think we're definitely getting more data. We're getting better data, new measures that we haven't tapped into previously, right? But also, like when you look at like outcomes and measures, there's something as simple as like just the quality of life questionnaires, right?
Mm.
It's out there, but I'd love to know like what is the percentage of studies that really use quality of life questionnaires, right? A lot of times we ask that questions like, don't you want to measure the patient's quality of life? And they're like, nope, we've got a specific goal. We only want to measure, are they going to the bathroom or not? Right.
Mm.
Well, that's cool, but what about the patient? What about the patient experience? Um, if I'm a patient in a study, I want to be involved as part of that study. I want to be involved from the perspective of I want to see that they care about me and I'm not just another data point, you
Mm.
know. Um,
But
but
in my experience, it's because those are two different use cases. The quality are useful for health technology outcomes for reimbursement purposes, whereas the
mhm,
clinical folks they're squarely focused on getting the drug approved and submitting to health authorities.
yeah,
And those two groups have not really aligned on the same data that we collect from the same patients.
yeah, but patient experience, it shouldn't matter from a, I mean, we're in an industry that's caring, right? We're
Mm,
supposed to be here to save lives. So if we're here to save lives, why are we not here to really kind of learn about that patient experience and make sure that,
mm,
I'm saving your life, but I'm also interested to make sure that I want your experience to be better. I mean, some of these drugs, I mean, I put my family through clinical trials. I've been part of the clinical trials, and the experience is like a hit or miss, honestly, you
mm.
know? So, yeah, there's a lot there.
There's a lot there. Have you experienced any wearables that have a clear clinical purpose and use?
Ooh, it's a good one. The one thing that I always tell about wearables is every wearable is good at one thing, but is not good at everything, right?
Mm, mhm,
So we'll talk about, let's say, the Cardia or Apple Watch or Withings. Like each one of them is like really solid about one thing. And the other pieces are like, okay. Like for example, if I was to take the Apple Watch, right? Apple Watches, there's a ton of studies out there that talk about, they've got what, an 86% accuracy from collecting heart rate. However, what about step count? How accurate is it? If I
mhm,
was to take an Apple and a Garmin, well, Garmin is going to be a lot closer to realistic step count versus an Apple, just
mm,
because that's where they stand, right, with the GPS tracking, etc. So each one of those devices, we look at them as like it's really good at one thing. So we always tell people, if you're running a study, you want to use a wearable, what is the end outcome? What is the problem that you're trying to solve? Because everything stems from a specific problem that you're solving for or that you're looking to solve for.
mm,
We can help you identify, well, here's a good wearable that will get you, I don't know, 80% accuracy, 90% accuracy, right? Depending, of course, once again, on the actual outcome. I think it would help a lot better to kind of figure out what are we measuring and how do we want to measure it.
mm. And how do you learn about these different wearables and figure out what is it that they are good at?
This Look at my watch, right? Like I've got like a whole lot more on my desk, right? Like uh I'm in testing mode 24/7, right? My
Mm,
kids think I'm like I'm the craziest guy around. But there's gold standard, right? Gold standards
mhm,
from figuring out, the device, figuring out the data, measuring. So we use when we measure something and we test something, we test using different devices. So that way we figure out which ones are really more accurate, which ones are not, right? And we'll do some crazy things as in like I'm taking X number of steps or I'm taking X number of movements to kind of like, for example, I was actually um I've been testing Fitbits like crazy, right? Because I'm
mm,
trying to figure out what are they really good at,
yeah.
right? And like I'll use like the step counter, the sleep, and I could be like working out in my spot and just kind of standing up and down. And guess what? The step count on the Fitbit is just gonna keep moving. If I'm wearing an Apple and a Fitbit and a Samsung, for example, Apple and Samsung have done a much better job because guess what? If I'm going up and down, my step count hasn't moved because I haven't moved,
Mm,
versus Fitbit, it's moving every movement I make.
yeah.
So we do things like that to kind of figure out what really works, what really doesn't work, but and what really meets the real needs for some of these devices.
Mm. And this leads me to ask you about what you mentioned in our pre-call, this concept of wearables as a service. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. It's something I'm really passionate and excited about, right? Like as we look at it, every single one of these tools right here, right? They all have like sensors built in them. But what I struggle with is if you want to use a device, there's only one app that you have to do. Well, what if you want to use three different devices? Then you've got to download three different apps of some
Mhm,
sort. Well, then what if I download the apps? How am I going to get the apps to, let's say, a scientist like yourself or somebody else that can correlate the data, right?
mhm,
So at Delve Help, with as part of our clinical study pal platform, which is an end-to-end platform that can collect data from patients, improve data, patient engagement, etc. we've developed the concept of wearables as a service, which basically means I can integrate multiple wearables into a specific study, and onto a specific patient, I can assign one or more wearables for that patient, right? So the beauty here is we've kind of broken from the silos of you've got to
Mm,
download multiple apps, multiple tools to I don't really need anything else other than, depending on the device. But for example, if you're using a device that is cellular enabled, I'll find a way to get you an app that's downloaded directly onto the device, right?
mm,
Or if it has to have some sort of an SDK, because this is kind of what the device allows, then I'm going to only ask you to only download only one app for your entire study, right?
mm,
So here we're collecting data from multiple sensors, but also the way that we collect data from sensors um, is going to differ. The way that we're going to manage compliance across different devices is going to differ. Um, Depending on the organization, depending on how we're getting the data, some of the devices we're able to upload our own app that can truly collect the sensor data directly from these watches or whatever. And some of them we can't. Some of them we have to connect using like an SDK or API.
mhm,
But at the end of the day, we're going to get the data. We're going to get the
mm,
data into a central hub where we can report on it. But then how do
mm,
you manage compliance, right? So when you think about
mm,
compliance, one of the more common ones you hear about is sites get frustrated because if they're not getting data from these patients, they're on the hook to pick up the phone and call these patients. And guess what? Sites are always like, we don't want any more devices for these patients, right?
mm,
So we've automated that within our system where you can configure the system to, I want to look for data every 4 hours, every 8 hours, whatever that is. And based on whether we hear or we don't hear, we can send off automated messages, emails, etc., to the patient, their caregiver, etc. But then we also have our own concierge team that can pick up the phone, call the patients, and figure out like,
mm,
is it a support issue? Is it a problem with the device? Do we need to do something? So that way, we're truly reducing the burden off the site. We are providing the extra capabilities and services for these patients to make sure that we're able to improve the data outcomes and improve compliance from a patient's perspective, right? So as we look at it, this is kind of our concept of wearables as a service, right? Figure out what wearable you want. We'll integrate all the different wearables. We'll help provide feedback on what we need to do, but also centralizing the sensor data into one repository versus multiple
mm.
tools. So yeah.
I like that you've reduced a lot of these wearables to their sensor piece
Yeah.
and the data that you can actually get, and actually made it workable for conducting clinical trials or health as such. But have you had any feedback from the creators of these wearables for how they feel about you actually like stripping their offering down to the main components?
It depends on who we talk
Mm,
to, right? We talk to quite a few of them. Some of them are open to partnerships and, enabling us to kind of be part in the middle to kind of really help from a research perspective, enable better data collection. And some of them, honestly, they're like, hey, listen, we're comfortable with just kind of pushing out data every 5 minutes, and this is you get what you get.
mm,
So it depends. At the end of the day, it comes down to true collaboration. Are they really kind of here to help us advance research and advance patient lives, or they're just here to just kind of sell us a device and that's it? So it varies and it depends. Actually, one of the more recent ones that we've been kind of testing is, I think I told you, like the circle,
mm,
this circle ring, right? Um, but this is an example where they're like, hey, we'll give you data every second, we'll give you data every 5 minutes, depending on what it really is, which really kind of helps us and allows us to help sponsors and pharma medical device companies as well.
mm. So now we've kind of talked about the more structured piece of clinical data. Um, could this also be used in healthcare more broadly?
Yeah, for sure. We see a bigger need for it in the digital health space. We've got a couple of partnerships in the digital health space where we're empowering digital health tools with the wearables, right? Where, for example, a patient can put on a Samsung, Apple, Fitbit, doesn't matter. And within that digital health solution, we can track what's happening to that patient at home and provide suggestions, whether it's your sleep has not been good, you're too stressed, have you tried these vitamins? Have you tried these test kits? But also we're seeing hospitals that are looking to deploy more of these tools at home to provide better remote patient monitoring capabilities. So that way they can, reduce hospital visits, they can improve patient care. So I think there's a ton of opportunities from a wearable perspective. When we look at wearables, there's just 2023 alone, over 1.2 billion wearable devices have been sold,
Mm,
right? And that number has gone up nearly 35% year over year.
mm.
And it's global. It's not just US, right? It's US and the Middle East and Europe. So it's everywhere. Everybody is buying these wearables and putting them on.
That's a very large number. Uh,
Amazing.
okay. One more thing I wanted to ask about the usage from a patient perspective, as an individual. Uh, does one also need to test all the wearables to understand what might make a difference, or are there some shortcuts that can be taken?
When it comes to patients, like you and I are different. You and I are going to have different habits. You and I are going to wear our ring different. And it's interesting because some patients, they'll put on like a Fitbit and they're like, this thing kind of irritates me. I don't want to
Mm,
wear it anymore. Um, and we have to be thoughtful. We have to listen to the patients and kind of figure out like, it could be something as simple as like the wearable is just not for that patient, right?
mm,
They're just not going to wear it, period. Let's just kind of retract it and give it to someone else that is going to use it. We get a lot of questions about uh, age, for example, right? And I'll tell you the most best compliance pieces are patients that are, 55 years and older. They're a lot more compliant than younger patients because they want to be more involved in their health. Um, so it really varies quite a bit. It depends quite a bit from patients, but we go back and it's actually one of the core pieces why we have developed a true patient engagement capability within the tool, because we want to listen to the patients. We want to collect
mm,
them what's important to kind of figure out where do we need to change and catch issues as they become issues. It really becomes more of opportunities at one point, right? Um, our pushback a lot of times is really from an IRB, a protocol, a sponsor. They're like, nope, we don't want to go that far. We don't want to go there with the patient. So it varies.
mm. That makes sense. Wissam, I'm curious about your experience in this space in general, because I know that this is your third technology company in the health space. Uh, I would love to hear more about your perspectives on, has it become easier to create something new and useful? Uh, what has the evolution looked like from your perspective?
Like as I mentioned early on, this industry is very slow to adopt.
Mm,
Um, it has become more difficult to develop new tools. Um, yeah, but I think there's a lot there are a lot of opportunities, right? So kind of with AI and Chat GPT and more wearables on the market and more apps on the market, um, I think it's gonna get tougher. I think we're
mm,
gonna have access to a lot more data than we ever had access to before.
mm,
And as we think of, like, I don't know, think of like the neural networks, right? And how that
mm,
all can grow, and like, good God, what can we do? Um, uh, I think research is going to get better overall over time. But I think it'll take us quite a bit of time, right? We
Mm.
need to push with better opportunities um and honestly kind of empower those different opportunities to to get there. Clinical research has been a fun place to be. Uh, I enjoy it more and more. I've talked to a lot of patients, and the patients that I've spoken to are one of the reasons why like I enjoy being here, truly like wanting to, can we truly push the needle? Can we truly do something different? Um, but I'm opportunistic.
Mm. That makes sense. Uh, what do you think is the greatest challenge for adopting more wearables into both clinical trials, but in the health space more generally?
Uh, Accuracy.
Mm.
It's the number one question we get, right? So accuracy, battery life, um, usage. Um, I think there are multiple challenges, but I think accuracy and battery life are probably the two most common ones
Mm.
that we see in the industry. Um, I think we have to integrate more of these wearables honestly into more studies so that way we can learn more, so that way we can implement better tools that can help us be a lot more accurate, right? But
Mm.
once again, I think if we can define some of this upfront, and a lot of times it's I don't know what I don't know, right? So
Mm.
if someone comes in and says, or if I'm trying to run a study and say like, hey, I want this data to be 90% accurate, is it realistic or not? I don't know, I'll be honest with you, right? Because it's going to depend on the patient population. It's going to depend on the disease state. It's going to depend on, am I asking the patient to charge this wearable every 15 minutes, right? Um, it it's it's going to differ dramatically. I mean, if I count kind of the different types of wearables, I mean, we get wearables from like rings to watches to like a chest strap. And
Mm.
some of those chest straps, some of them are painful because guess what? I gotta I gotta stick it onto my chest with some sort of a tape, right? And someone like
Mm.
myself that's a bit hairy, right? Like I'm
Mm.
like when I pull this out, it's gonna be painful, right? So it's gonna differ. I think
Mm.
we have to be realistic with our expectations, and think about it from an agile perspective. We're gonna learn, we're gonna implement what we learned, and it's a process. We if you look at where EDC started in this space,
Mm.
where we are today, it's been a lot of years. So
Yes.
yeah.
And that's another question I have for you. We see this divergence between development times for drugs, which are still very long, and for wearables, which are relatively shorter, and they do get better and better in shorter cycles. Uh, do you think that they will ever be able to converge somehow? That the two can that they can find a mirror union, or will they just keep evolving at two different speeds?
I I think there's gonna be two different speeds, right? Because when you think about like drugs and why it takes long for drugs, is because the different phases, the efficacy. It's something that's going inside your body, and when it's inside your body, you don't really know what it's doing inside your body, right? Versus if it's a wearable, I'm using it, it's outside my aura, I can easily just kind of take it if it's causing me a rash and take it off and kind of move on. So I don't know that drug timelines are going to shorten a ton more. I'm hopeful that we can do more better, that we can run more studies as time goes on, cheaper, right?
Mm.
Involve more patients, but then patient recruitment is a problem. So yeah.
Mm. Okay, well, Wissam, could you tell us more about how you ended up in this space?
uh yeah, so I graduated college, and it was in the heart of the bubble in couldn't find a job, and someone was working on something, and he said like, "Hey, you want to join?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. I don't really have anything else to do." So I joined a company, and we our first product failed. We pivoted and we developed a couple of other products, and one of them was bought out by PPD back in '04, and
Mm,
I just kind of stuck to it. I enjoyed kind of the entrepreneurial aspect. I've worked for um, you know, worked for other larger organizations like Optums and et cetera in the past, but healthcare and life sciences is where my passion is.
mm. Well, I can definitely relate to that. Uh, and there's that's also a perfect segue to the question that we always ask our guests at the end of each episode. If we gave you the transformation trials magic wand, and now this magic wand has the ability to grant one wish that can fundamentally change the life sciences industry, what would you wish for?
Better patient experience. That's like the one thing that I kind of live on, honestly. Better patient experience, um, and reducing the number of tools that we're giving the patients. Automation is huge, right? So how much of this can we truly automate so that way we can reduce the burden off the patient and the sites?
Mm,
And I think in these two, there's just a ton of work that needs to happen still.
mm. That's a good wish. Well, if our listeners want to learn more about you, ask you more questions, or want to learn more about Delve Health, where can they find you?
Yeah, definitely delvehealth.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn, kind of reach out. I do some videos on LinkedIn every now and then with, here's what I learned today. Here's where that's cool about this wearable or not. So always love sharing our experience in hope that it will help benefit everybody else in the industry.
Mm. Well, I hope our listeners do reach out. And thank you so much for coming on the show. This was super interesting.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.